From the moment Diana Silva tied her navy blue apron around her waist that evening, she never could have imagined how her life was about to change forever. She had spent 5 years blending into the pristine environment of OE, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, mastering the art of being invisible. Being the only black waitress there had taught her that discretion was not just a skill, but a necessity. So, when the silence in the dining room grew so heavy, it felt like an added weight on her chest. Diana's instinct was to retreat into the background. Every pair of eyes had shifted, not toward her, but to the small boy standing between the elegantly set tables. Leo Monroe, only 10 years old, with thin, trembling legs encased in cold metal braces, extended his hand towards her. The pianist had just started a gentle, romantic melody. No one expected movement from that child, much less an invitation. The manager's sharp voice sliced through the tense quiet. "Sir, control your son. This is inappropriate. This is not a dance hall." Diana's eyes darted to the man at the corner table. Richard Monroe, billionaire, one of the most powerful men in the country, and father to the boy now publicly shamed. Diana knew she should step back, ignore the boy's hand, and carry on as though none of this was happening. But she couldn't. The boy's outstretched fingers quivered, not from weakness alone, but from the courage it took to ask. She had seen that look before, on the children she taught dance to at the community center no one here knew existed. Without removing her apron, Diana loosened it, folded it onto her tray, and with an almost imperceptible breath, she reached out and took Leo's hand. Richard Monroe stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, causing a collective gasp among the diners. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice struggling to remain controlled. Diana didn't waver. She held his gaze, not with defiance, but with a quiet, unflinching resolve. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." The entire room felt frozen in that instant, as though the world itself had paused to witness what would happen next. Leo took a hesitant step forward, his foot dragging along the floor, the sound of the metal braces groaning against the marble echoing like an act of rebellion against the suffocating decorum of the space. Diana didn't pull him, didn't guide him. She simply moved at his pace, matching the rhythm of his bravery. Around them, whispered predictions floated between tables. She'll be fired for sure. But Diana wasn't thinking about the job she would likely lose. She focused solely on the boy who, for the first time since the accident 2 years ago, wasn't being led or corrected, but was leading. The look in Leo's eyes shifted, fear receding, replaced by a flicker of determination. Diana had seen this transformation before too, in children much like him, the fragile, electric moment when they realized they were capable of something no one believed they could do. She knew then that whether she danced for a minute or an hour, what mattered was that he had chosen to stand, to move, to invite connection. "Mr. Monroe?" Manager Baxter's voice cut through Richard's racing thoughts, dragging him back to the present. "I assure you this will never happen again. She will be properly disciplined." But Richard didn't answer. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting to see how he, one of the country's most powerful men, would respond. After all, a man like him could end someone's career with a single word. Staff stood frozen. Other diners leaned in with morbid curiosity, their wine glasses hovering in midair. But none of that mattered to Richard in that moment. All he could see was his son's small, tentative smile as Diana guided him back to their table after just 3 shy yet monumental steps of dance. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, formally, as though speaking to an adult, not a child. It was an honor. Then she turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her. "Wait!" It sounded different, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. "What's your full name?" Diana turned back, her expression composed despite the tremor in her fingers. "Diana Silva, sir." Richard nodded slowly, repeating her name under his breath as if committing it to memory. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, and extended it toward her. "My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. The entire restaurant inhaled collectively. Diana accepted the card with no outward reaction, but her hand shook slightly as she tucked it into her pocket and turned to leave. As Diana walked away, Leo tugged at his father's sleeve, his young voice filled with innocent confusion. "Dad, why did you do that?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the chandeliers suspended above them. Richard looked down at his son, and for a brief moment, saw not just the child that Elise had left in his care, but an entire person, complete with wants and needs he had systematically ignored for 2 years. He didn't answer right away. The dinner continued, but the opulence of OA felt suddenly suffocating, its crystal, silverware, and imported linens losing all significance under the weight of what had just transpired. No one noticed the way Diana glanced back once before exiting, not with fear, not with resignation, but with a calm determination that starkly contrasted with the emotional storm brewing inside Richard Monroe. What neither of them knew at that moment was how that brief, silent dance had already set in motion a transformation neither could have predicted. It was a story not of charity or pity, but of connection. A story that would soon ripple beyond the confines of that exclusive restaurant and alter all of their lives in ways none of them yet understood. The next morning, the marble and glass walls of Monroe Tower gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting Diana's apprehension as she approached. Wearing her best outfit, a navy skirt and a white blouse she had bought on clearance, Diana couldn't help but feel out of place among the people who passed by her, their designer clothes likely costing more than her monthly rent. Clutching her worn-out purse tightly, she walked up to the reception desk and cleared her throat. "Diana Silva, I'm here to see Mr. Monroe," she said with quiet confidence. The receptionist barely looked up, her cold gaze scanning Diana before making a quick call. "18th floor, Ms. Valerie will meet you." Diana nodded, muttering a polite thanks before stepping into the sleek elevator. As the doors closed, she exhaled deeply, pressing her bag tighter to her chest. It wasn't fear she felt, it was a calm determination, the same kind that had carried her through far worse situations than this. When the elevator doors opened, Valerie, an impeccably dressed woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, greeted her with professional detachment. "Mr. Monroe is finishing a video conference. Please, follow me." As they walked through the gleaming corridors, Diana could feel the curious stares of employees. A black woman being escorted through the executive floors was rare enough to spark speculation. Then, without warning, Valerie spoke, her voice low but pointed as they stood alone in a waiting room. "He called you up here to fire you, didn't he?" Diana turned to her, arching an eyebrow. "It happens," Valerie added with a shrug. "Powerful clients complain and people like us lose our jobs." Diana caught the implication but didn't rise to the bait. Valerie adjusted her glasses and added coolly, "Employees who don't know their place." Diana gave a small, almost amused smile. "And where exactly would that place be?" Before Valerie could answer, her phone buzzed. "He'll see you now." Diana rose from the chair and followed Valerie through a set of towering glass doors. Richard Monroe's office took up nearly half the floor, and through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched out below like a toy playground. The man himself stood with his back to her, staring out at his empire. "Mr. Monroe," Diana greeted him, her tone formal and steady. He turned slowly, his expression as practiced and controlled as always. "Ms. Silva, thank you for coming." He gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." The heavy silence that followed wasn't accidental. Diana recognized it immediately. It was the kind of silence designed to make people nervous enough to talk too much, to reveal things they didn't intend. But she remained quiet, waiting. Diana sat down slowly, her posture straight but not rigid, determined to maintain her composure. She was acutely aware of every detail, the subtle hum of the air conditioning, the soft leather of the chair beneath her, the distant echo of heels clicking down the corridor outside. Across from her, Richard Monroe remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the city as though it were an entity he could command at will. Then finally, he turned to face her fully, moving to sit across the wide minimalist desk that separated them. "Do you have a degree?" he asked abruptly, breaking the silence with a question that sounded more like an interrogation than polite conversation. Diana didn't flinch. "Yes, bachelor's in child development from the University of Sao Paulo. Incomplete master's in special education." She kept her voice steady, matching his cold professionalism with her own practiced restraint. For a brief second, something flickered across Richard's otherwise impassive face. Surprise, perhaps. "And yet, you work as a waitress." Diana nodded without hesitation. "I have 3 jobs, actually. The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring when I can find students." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if reassessing the woman in front of him. Then, without warning, he reached for a black leather folder on the desk, flipping it open and revealing a stack of printed documents. "I did some research on you, Ms. Silva," he said, his tone neutral but laced with something that could have been curiosity or suspicion. "I wanted to understand who was the person who—" He hesitated, the words catching slightly. "Danced with my son." He turned the folder around for her to see. There, clipped neatly, were photos of a modest community center, Pasos Livre, or Free Steps. Diana felt her spine straighten instinctively, her heart quickening despite her best efforts to remain calm. "You founded this 6 years ago," Richard continued, flipping through additional pages that included not just photos but documents, program descriptions, grant proposals, participant testimonials. "I co-founded it with my sister Zara," Diana clarified, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about something that mattered deeply to her. "It's a dance program for children with physical disabilities." Richard's eyes scanned the materials without comment for a few moments. Then he said flatly, "It's about to close due to lack of funding." Diana didn't respond immediately, watching him carefully. Of course he knew that. A man like Richard Monroe could uncover anyone's life story in less than 24 hours. "I didn't come here to ask for money," she said finally, her tone even but firm. "No?" he countered, raising an eyebrow. "Then why did you come?" Diana leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Because you asked me to." That simple statement seemed to catch Richard off guard. He let out a faint, almost involuntary chuckle, a rare sound of unguarded emotion breaking through his usual veneer of control. "Fair enough," he conceded, standing up abruptly as if the conversation had become too intimate too quickly. He paced slowly behind his desk, staring once more out the towering windows. "I want you to work for me." Diana blinked, genuinely surprised by the proposition but keeping her reaction measured. "As what? A waitress at your house?" she asked dryly. Richard turned back to face her, his expression hardening. "As a therapeutic companion. For Leo." He said his son's name with noticeable difficulty, as though it was still too laden with grief to be spoken easily. Diana's eyebrows lifted subtly at the unexpected proposition, but she remained composed, her hands resting calmly on her lap. She noticed, however, that when Richard said Leo's name, his eyes involuntarily flicked to a framed photo on his desk. A beautiful woman with soft features and a radiant smile holding an infant in her arms. The photo, she realized, must be of his late wife and Leo. The weight of the room seemed to shift, thickening with the unspoken loss that permeated everything between this man and his child. Richard's voice broke through her thoughts. "I have the best specialists in the country, physical therapists, neurologists, psychologists, but what you did last night." He trailed off for a moment, as though struggling to frame it in clinical terms. It wasn't a treatment. It wasn't structured. His hands gripped the edge of the desk tightly, knuckles pale. It was different. He smiled. The confession left him visibly shaken, like a man confronting his own helplessness for the first time. Diana's voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but resolute. "It was just a dance, Mr. Monroe." Richard shook his head with a humorless laugh. "You don't understand. It was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident." The words hung between them, raw and undeniable. He paced again, his figure tense against the backdrop of the sprawling city skyline. "I don't want a dancer for my son," he clarified at last, stopping to look directly at her. "I want someone who can do what you did, someone who can follow his lead, not force him to follow theirs." Diana studied him carefully, peeling back the layers of corporate armor and seeing, beneath them, not the ruthless billionaire the world knew, but a father, adrift and desperate. Richard took a deep breath, regaining his usual steely composure. "I can pay you 5 times what you make now." The offer landed heavily between them, but Diana didn't flinch. She stood up slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving his. "No." The single word cut through the spacious office like a clean blade. Richard recoiled slightly, as though physically struck, clearly unaccustomed to hearing rejection, especially in this building, within these walls where his wealth and power usually guaranteed instant compliance. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice tight with disbelief. Diana tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but unwavering. I don't work for people who see only my color or my social class before they see my competence, she said evenly, her voice imbued with a quiet dignity that filled the vast space more effectively than any shout. And I definitely don't work for people who think they can buy solutions to emotional problems. Richard's cheeks flushed with something that might have been shame or anger. It was hard to tell. He opened his mouth to respond, but Diana spoke first. You're offering me a position that would solve my financial struggles, but I'm refusing it. Not out of pride, Mr. Monroe, but out of dignity. She took a step toward the door, then paused, turning back to him one last time. Your son doesn't need another specialist. He needs space. Space to lead his own life. Richard's jaw clenched tightly as he replied, You don't know my son. Diana smiled faintly. No, but I know people like him. People whose physical limitations are nothing compared to the invisible cages we build around them. She reached into her purse and placed a simple card on his desk. Free steps. Classes Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. If you want to bring Leo, the first class is free. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking decisively against the marble floor. As Diana exited the building, her mind replayed the entire encounter, not with regret, but with an odd sense of liberation. She had stood her ground in front of one of the most powerful men in the country and left with her integrity intact. Back in her small apartment on the east side of the city, hidden under her bed, was a notebook filled with years of observations, research, and personal reflections about children like Leo and men like Richard Monroe. She knew their types well. Children, trapped not only by physical challenges but by the emotional walls their well-meaning families built around them. And parents who, despite their resources, struggled to see their children as more than projects to be fixed. Her entire mission with Free Steps had been born from this understanding that movement, choice, and autonomy were more powerful forms of therapy than any structured clinical intervention. That night, as she prepared a simple dinner of rice and beans, she glanced at the business card Richard had given her, still tucked into the side pocket of her worn-out purse. She smiled to herself, knowing full well that men like him didn't simply let things go. He would come, if not for her, then for his son. And when he did, she would be ready, not as someone desperate for a job, but as someone who had something he could never buy, an authentic understanding of what Leo truly needed. Diana didn't have to wait long. The following Wednesday, while she was at the community center preparing for the afternoon class, her sister Zara, co-founder of Free Steps, came running into the reception area, her hijab slightly askew, eyes wide with excitement. There's a luxury car parked outside, she whispered urgently, leaning close. And you won't believe who's in it. Diana glanced up, setting down the stack of mats she had been organizing, and moved toward the window. Sure enough, there it was. A sleek, black imported car, its tinted windows offering little hint of who was inside. But then, as if on cue, she spotted a small face pressed against the glass. Leo, eyes wide with nervous anticipation, peering out at the unfamiliar surroundings. In the driver's seat, Richard sat stiffly, gripping the steering wheel like it was anchoring him to the car. He's not going to come in, Zara predicted, standing beside her sister, arms crossed protectively. Men like him don't come to places like this. Diana chuckled softly, shaking her head at Zara's cynicism. Don't underestimate the power of a determined child, she replied knowingly, recalling the brave, trembling hand that had reached for hers just days earlier. They stood there in silence, watching as the passenger door opened slowly. Leo emerged first, carefully adjusting his leg braces as he stepped out onto the uneven pavement. And then, to their shared astonishment, Richard followed, stepping out of the car with a hesitant awkwardness, dressed in casual clothes that looked foreign on him, khakis and a navy sweater that still screamed wealth despite his attempt to appear understated. Diana watched quietly from the doorway as Richard surveyed his surroundings, clearly uncomfortable but determined. The community center was a far cry from the opulence he was accustomed to, an old converted warehouse with hand-painted murals on the walls that read phrases like, "Your rhythm, your rules, and every move counts." The faint sounds of upbeat music floated from one of the back rooms, mixing with the occasional burst of children's laughter. Richard's gaze shifted uneasily from the chipped paint on the walls to the group of children inside, many using various mobility aids, wheelchairs, walkers, prosthetics. Leo stood beside him, looking up expectantly. Diana stepped outside, meeting them with the same calm professionalism she had shown in his office. "Mr. Monroe," she greeted, extending a hand. "Welcome." Richard took it after a brief hesitation, his grip firm but betraying a slight tremor. Leo, on the other hand, beamed at her, his previous shyness replaced by a quiet excitement. "Is it okay if we—" he began, looking from Diana to the group of children practicing inside. Diana knelt down to his level, smiling warmly. "Of course, Leo. Would you like to join them?" He nodded eagerly but glanced at his father for reassurance. Richard shifted his weight awkwardly before nodding. "Go ahead. I'll be right here." As Leo made his way carefully into the studio, adjusting his braces with practiced precision, Zara approached Richard with a folding chair. "First day's always the hardest," she remarked softly, offering him the seat. "For the parents, not the kids." Richard sat down stiffly, his eyes never leaving his son as Leo navigated through the room, greeted by curious glances and welcoming smiles from other children. Diana watched the interaction closely, noting Richard's protective posture, his instinctive need to intervene, but also his willingness to hold back. "This isn't therapy," Richard remarked after a moment, his tone a mixture of skepticism and defensiveness. Diana, now standing beside him, followed his gaze into the studio where Leo had begun mimicking the simple dance movements demonstrated by another child with a prosthetic leg. "No," she agreed softly. "It's not therapy in the traditional sense. It's autonomy." Richard frowned, clearly struggling to reconcile the informal, almost chaotic atmosphere of free steps with the structured clinical world of rehabilitation he was used to. "I've hired the best specialists in the country," he added quickly, almost as if justifying himself to her, or to himself. "Neurologists, physical therapists. They've all said he needs strict routines, protocols." Diana nodded, understanding his internal conflict. "And how has that been working for Leo?" she asked, gently, not accusatorily but with genuine curiosity. Richard didn't answer immediately, his jaw tightening as he watched his son attempt a new sequence of steps, his movements tentative but determined. At that moment, the studio door creaked open and an elderly woman entered, leaning on an ornate cane. Her silver hair was woven into elegant braids, and she carried herself with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. Zara nudged Diana subtly. "Dr. Eliana Matos," she whispered, reverence evident in her voice. "Neuroscientist, retired from the University of São Paulo." Diana nodded, familiar with the doctor's pivotal role in the program's research. Dr. Matos moved gracefully through the studio, exchanging greetings with several children before noticing Richard. Her eyes narrowed slightly as recognition dawned. "Mr. Monroe," she said, approaching him with a knowing smile. "You rejected my research proposal 3 times over the last 2 years." Richard stood up, clearly taken aback by the sudden confrontation. "Dr. Matos, I wasn't expecting to see you here," he admitted, his voice carefully controlled but edged with discomfort. The last time he had seen her name had been on yet another proposal he'd quickly dismissed, deeming it too unconventional and risky for investment by his philanthropic foundation. Dr. Matos adjusted her cane, her sharp eyes never leaving his. "I supervise the research here," she explained calmly. "We're studying how non-directive approaches to movement impact neural reconfiguration in children with motor challenges." Richard's brow furrowed. "Neural reconfiguration?" he repeated, skepticism woven into every syllable. Dr. Matos smiled gently, used to this reaction. "Yes, we've found that when children are allowed to move without strict correction, when they are free to explore, to make mistakes, their brains develop new pathways. They regain function through autonomy, not compliance." Richard glanced toward the studio window, where Leo was now laughing quietly as he balanced on one leg, mimicking another child's move. "I thought this was just some kind of community dance." "Class," Dr. Matos chuckled softly. "A common misconception. But no, Mr. Monroe, this is a pilot motor rehabilitation program grounded in cutting-edge neuroscience." As Diana returned from checking on the group, Richard turned to her with a faintly accusatory look. "Why are you working as a waitress if you're involved in a research program like this?" Diana shrugged, unbothered by the implication. "Because we don't have adequate funding, and because people like you rejected us 3 times. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He looked at Dr. Matos, then back at Diana. You were her assistant on those proposals. Co-author, Dr. Matos corrected firmly, laying a protective hand on Diana's shoulder. Diana has been instrumental to the theoretical framework behind this program. For a moment, Richard was at a loss for words, processing the collision between his assumptions and this new reality. You knew who I was. At the restaurant, he said finally, his voice quieter, more measured. Diana nodded without hesitation. From the moment you walked in. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to read her intentions. And when Leo stood up to dance, she met his gaze steadily. I recognized the opportunity to show you something, not to tell you. He leaned back, his expression a complicated blend of suspicion and reluctant admiration. So, it was staged. Diana shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. Leo chose to stand up. I chose to follow. Richard glanced back, through the glass at his son, now seated on the floor with a group of children, all experimenting with creative movements in their own unique ways. Just then, a group of reporters entered the studio, their cameras and notepads ready. Richard stiffened instantly, turning sharply to Diana. What is this? Part 2 of your plan? He asked coldly. Diana allowed herself a faint smile as Zara approached with a printed article in her hand. We published our preliminary research findings today, Zara explained, handing the article to Richard. The headline read, Revolutionary motor rehabilitation method shows promising results. Dr. Matos added, We invited the press to witness this milestone. Richard's jaw tightened as he looked around, realizing the eyes of the media were already shifting toward him, sensing a story in the making. You used my son for a publicity stunt, he accused, his voice icy and low. But Diana calmly gestured toward a side room, leading him away from the prying eyes. Come, she said quietly. Let me show you what this is really about. Diana guided Richard into a small adjoining room, its walls lined with photographs of children who had passed through the Free Steps program. Each photo was accompanied by handwritten notes detailing milestones, a first unsupported step, a new movement sequence, a moment of unrestrained laughter. The faces beamed with pride and accomplishment, their stories silently chronicling the power of autonomy and healing. On the far wall hung an empty frame. Richard paused, staring at it, then turned to Diana with a questioning look. What's that? He asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual corporate authority. Diana followed his gaze. Our future, she replied simply. That's where we'll put the plans for a full-scale rehabilitation center, if we can ever secure the funding. She didn't need to explain further. Richard could do the math in his head. Instead of 50 children a year, the center could serve 500, providing opportunities for independence and self-expression that no medical protocol alone could offer. He exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the realization. You orchestrated all of this, he murmured, more to himself than to her. The dance, the meeting, bringing me here on Media Day. Diana met his gaze, unflinching. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. 4 months ago, when you canceled our scheduled meeting without even reading our proposal, I promised myself I would find another way. Before Richard could respond, a voice called out from the studio. Diana. Zara's tone was urgent, tinged with alarm. Without hesitation, they both hurried back, instinct overriding conversation. When they re-entered the studio, they found a circle of children gathered in silent awe around Leo, who stood at the center of the room. The music had stopped, yet all attention remained on him. To Richard's astonishment, Leo had removed one of his metal braces and was now attempting to balance with only a single support. His small frame quivered with the effort, but his eyes shone with fierce concentration. Leo! Richard instinctively took a step forward, but Diana gently caught his arm. Wait, she whispered, her voice steady but firm. Just watch. Richard hesitated, his paternal instincts warring with the unfamiliar advice. He clenched his fists, but obeyed, standing at Diana's side, as they both observed the boy take a deep breath, plant his foot, and miraculously take a full, independent step. It was small, shaky, but entirely his own. The room erupted in applause, children cheering, teachers smiling, cameras clicking rapidly to capture the moment. Richard felt his throat tighten, his carefully constructed composure crumbling in the face of something no amount of power or wealth could manufacture. Genuine human triumph. Beside him, Diana spoke softly, her voice barely audible over the applause. "This is why we created Free Steps. It's not about perfect strides. It's about first steps taken on their own." Richard's eyes glistened as he watched his son, not as a problem to be solved or a legacy to protect, but as a full human being discovering his own strength. For the first time in years, Richard Monroe wasn't managing or controlling the moment. He was simply present, witnessing something real, something transformative. As the applause faded and Leo continued practicing his new step with quiet determination, the reporters in the room began to shift their attention. One recognized Richard, and soon a murmur spread among the press corps. Cameras turned toward him, notebooks opened, microphones discreetly pointed in his direction. Richard, still visibly shaken by what he had witnessed, stood silently, uncertain whether to stay or flee. He had spent decades building a public image of control, intelligence, and composure. But here, in this modest, colorful space where children defied expectations not with surgery or science, but with trust and rhythm, that image didn't quite fit. A reporter stepped closer, voice cautious but curious. "Mr. Monroe, can you comment on your presence here today? Is it true your foundation rejected this program's funding requests multiple times?" The question echoed with weight, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Richard turned to Leo, who was now beaming as he showed another child how to shift balance between braces. Then he looked at Diana, who remained by his side, patient and steady, offering no cues or guidance, only space. For once, he didn't rehearse a response or calculate his optics. He simply exhaled. "Do you know what's hardest for someone in my position?" he asked, directing his words toward the reporter, but loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Admitting when we're wrong." The hush that fell was complete, the kind of silence that settles before something historic is said. The Monroe Foundation is proud to announce a full 5-year funding commitment to the Free Steps program, he declared. "And we will be building a permanent rehabilitation center based entirely on the methodology developed here by Dr. Matos and Ms. Silva." Flashes went off like fireworks, but Richard didn't flinch. He turned to Diana and added, for everyone to hear, "With one condition. Ms. Silva retains full autonomy over the program. No corporate interference, period." 3 months later, the construction site buzzed with activity. The lot, once empty and overgrown, was now the birthplace of the new Free Steps Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't the flashiest project the Monroe Foundation had ever funded, but it was by far the most human. Every room was being designed with direct input from the children and families who would use them. Wide hallways for mobility aids, soft floor textures for balance practice, even quiet zones for sensory breaks. Every detail was shaped by lived experience, not boardroom decisions. Diana visited the site regularly, overseeing progress and offering feedback, but she was never alone. Leo came often, usually accompanied by other kids from the original program. He moved with more ease now, only needing one light brace on most days. But the bigger surprise to everyone involved wasn't Leo. It was Richard. The billionaire who once ruled from behind tinted glass and polished desks now showed up quietly, sometimes just to observe, other times to take notes. At first, the staff assumed it was a phase, a PR move. Maybe, but he kept coming. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints with Diana in a sun-drenched conference room filled with chalk drawings and coffee cups, she teased, "Never thought I'd see you at a planning meeting." Richard smiled, rubbing his tired eyes. "Never thought I'd be studying neuroplasticity at 50, he quipped, flipping through a binder marked with sticky notes and highlighter marks. Diana looked at him curiously. "Is this part of some public redemption arc, or do you actually care?" Richard's expression sobered. "Leo asked to have his second brace removed last week." Diana nodded. "I know, he told me." Richard swallowed hard. His former physical therapist said that wouldn't be possible for at least 2 more years. Diana gave a small smile. "But you fired her, remember? Because I said she was wrong." And she was. Richard followed Diana's gaze as she pointed to a photograph pinned on the wall. Leo, standing confidently with only a single crutch, his free arm raised, triumphantly as if declaring victory over the limitations once imposed on him. "He's progressing faster than any traditional prognosis predicted," Diana said softly, her voice tinged with pride but grounded in realism. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, the weight of everything they had navigated settling on his shoulders. For a man used to controlling outcomes through money, strategy, and influence, this new reality, that his son's greatest strides had come not from experts he had hired, but from a space he had once dismissed as amateur, was both humbling and transformative. "Why didn't you ever accept my apology?" Richard asked suddenly, his tone unusually vulnerable, as though the question had been simmering beneath his composed exterior for weeks. Diana tilted her head, considering him carefully. "Because you never offered one," she replied, her voice even but unmistakably firm. "You redirected resources, changed policies, funded our program, but that's not the same as an apology. That's compensation." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of her words. "Fair," he conceded, his voice quiet. The silence between them stretched for a moment, not tense, but contemplative, as if both were acknowledging how far they had come, not just in terms of the center's physical construction, but in their own understanding of what it meant to truly lead, support, and trust. Outside the window, construction workers maneuvered scaffolding and heavy equipment, erecting walls that would soon house the dreams of hundreds of children like Leo. The future that once felt unattainable now took shape with each brick laid and every beam lifted into place, not just through Richard's money, but through Diana's vision and unwavering conviction. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. The grand opening of the Free Steps Rehabilitation Center bore no resemblance to that silent, tension-filled evening at OA. The expansive, sunlit atrium bustled with families, volunteers, therapists, and most importantly, children of all abilities moving freely through the space that had been designed for them, by them. At the center of it all, leading a small group in a simple, joyful dance sequence was Leo, no longer the hesitant boy hidden behind metal braces, but a confident, determined child, using only a lightweight support on his left leg. His movements, though still imperfect by clinical standards, radiated a self-assuredness that no expert or specialist could have prescribed. From a quiet corner, Richard watched with a mixture of awe and humility, standing beside Diana, who observed the scene with a quiet pride all her own. "He doesn't need you to hold him up anymore," she said softly, turning toward Richard. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his son. "No," he agreed, a faint smile curling at the edges of his mouth. "But he still needs me nearby. Big difference." Diana returned the smile, acknowledging the growth not just in Leo but in Richard as well. A reporter approached, microphone in hand, seizing the moment. "Mr. Monroe, how does it feel to witness your son's progress?" Richard turned to the journalist, his posture relaxed, his tone genuine. "Proud," he answered simply. "Not just for what he's overcome, but for what he's building, for himself and for others." The reporter followed up quickly. "And what's been the most important lesson you've learned from all this?" Richard glanced at Diana before focusing on Leo, now helping a younger girl balance on her prosthetic leg. He inhaled deeply and then said that true leaders don't always guide others down the path they believe is right. Sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is follow. 1 year later, the Free Steps program had expanded beyond what anyone could have imagined. Branches had opened in 3 additional cities, each modeled after the original center's inclusive design and philosophy. Diana found herself traveling more frequently, consulting with new AAN teams, training instructors, and speaking at conferences about the program's revolutionary approach to pediatric rehabilitation. Yet, despite the accolades and media attention, including the National Award for Innovation in Pediatric Rehabilitation she had recently received, Diana remained grounded. She continued to spend most of her time at the original center, where it all began, working alongside children and families who reminded her every day why this work mattered. Leo, now nearly 12, had enrolled in a regular school, navigating its hallways with only a lightweight cane on days when his balance needed extra support. But more than that, he had become the unofficial spokesperson for Free Steps, appearing in videos, speaking at events, and inspiring other children to see themselves not as broken or in need of fixing, but as capable individuals with their own unique rhythms. Richard, too, had undergone a transformation that few outside his inner circle could have predicted. He remained involved with the program, attending board meetings, quietly funding new expansions, and, more remarkably, continuing to show up, not as the billionaire benefactor, but as a father invested in a movement that had reshaped both his son's life and his own. For Richard, the lesson had been as profound as it was painful, that the power he had long wielded so effortlessly in business meant little when confronted with the inner lives of those he loved most. True power, he had learned, was not about control or dominance, but about knowing when to step back and allow others to lead. That realization had not come easily. It had been forged through moments of discomfort, through acknowledging mistakes, and through allowing himself to be vulnerable in ways he once believed were weaknesses. Now, as he watched Leo standing before an auditorium of parents and children, confidently sharing his story of overcoming not just physical limitations, but the expectations imposed on him, Richard understood that his son's journey had mirrored his own. Both had learned to move beyond the constraints placed on them, Leo by his disability and Richard by his identity as a man who believed he could purchase solutions to any problem. As applause filled the auditorium, Richard's eyes met Diana's across the room. They exchanged a nod, a simple but profound acknowledgement of all they had built together. In a world where power so often silences those with less of it, their story had proven that true transformation happens not through wealth or influence alone, but through connection, humility, and the courage to follow when someone else shows the way. Later that evening, after the auditorium had emptied and the last of the folding chairs had been stacked away, Diana stood alone in the quiet of the main studio, taking in the empty space that only hours earlier had been alive with movement and laughter. The walls, still decorated with children's artwork and motivational phrases like, "Your rhythm, your rules," bore silent witness to the countless moments of triumph and struggle that had unfolded within them. She ran her fingers absent-mindedly along the edge of the mirrored wall, reflecting on how far everything had come. Not just the program, but herself, Leo, and even Richard. The journey had been anything but linear, filled with resistance, skepticism, and moments of near defeat. Yet here they were. Free Steps had become a national model for inclusive rehabilitation, and children across the country were discovering possibilities that many adults had long denied them. She thought back to that pivotal evening at OA, when a boy's outstretched hand had changed the course of her life in an instant. Diana smiled faintly, recognizing that, in many ways, it wasn't she who had guided Leo. It was Leo who had shown her what it truly meant to lead, not by imposing a path, but by walking alongside, trusting in the process, and embracing the unknown. Just then, Richard entered the studio, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. He paused near the entrance, watching Diana silently for a moment before approaching. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its former authority, only something gentler, almost reflective. Diana turned to face him, leaning casually against the bar. "I was just taking it all in." Richard nodded, his gaze sweeping the familiar space. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," he admitted, his voice tinged with awe. "And yet in some ways it feels like it was always meant to be." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, neither needing to fill the air with words. Finally, Richard spoke again, his tone more personal than it had ever been. "Thank you for everything." Diana raised an eyebrow, amused. "Is that your long overdue apology?" Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, that's gratitude. The apology, that's still a work in progress." Diana laughed, quietly, her posture relaxing as she realized that this man, once so defined by his defenses, had finally learned to let them down. Together they looked out over the studio, no longer as adversaries from different worlds, but as co-architects of something far greater than either could have achieved alone. As the months turned into years, the legacy of Free Steps continued to ripple outward in ways no one had fully anticipated. The program's success inspired similar initiatives globally as rehabilitation centers and educators adopted its philosophy of autonomy-driven movement. Diana found herself fielding invitations to speak at international conferences, contributing to academic journals, and advising on policy changes that prioritize dignity and agency over rigid therapeutic regimens. Yet, despite the accolades and expanding influence, she remained deeply connected to the local center where it all began. She often reminded new instructors that the true heart of Free Steps wasn't in the research papers or the architectural blueprints. It was in the simple everyday moments when a child discovered they could do something no one believed they could. Leo embodied that spirit more than anyone. Now a teenager, he had outgrown his braces entirely, walking with only the occasional use of a light cane on long days. He had also taken on a leadership role within the program, mentoring younger children with the same gentle patience Diana had once shown him, watching him guide. Others, Diana often marveled at how their lives had intertwined in ways neither could have predicted that night at the restaurant. For Richard, the transformation had been even more profound. The man who once believed that problems could be solved with enough money and strategic maneuvering had come to understand that some of life's most important lessons required neither wealth nor power, just presence, humility, and the willingness to follow someone else's lead. He continued to support free steps financially, but more importantly, he became a steadfast advocate for systemic change, using his influence to challenge other institutions to reconsider how they approached rehabilitation and inclusion. On the anniversary of Free Steps' founding, Richard stood beside Diana and Leo at the center's annual celebration. As Leo took the stage to deliver a speech to a packed auditorium of children, parents, therapists, and supporters, Richard felt a swell of pride, not in what he had built, but in what he had learned to let go of. Diana, standing beside him, leaned over and whispered, "You followed him all the way here." Richard smiled, his eyes glistening as he replied, "And he led me somewhere I never knew I needed to be." In a world often divided by power, privilege, and preconceived limits, their story stood as a quiet but profound testament to the simple truth that sometimes the most transformative act is not to lead, but to follow.